Hello friends, I'm Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is the 7th edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor. I hope you are doing well today. As you know, the Russian newspaper's Monitor is made possible by the viewers like you. Our Kickstarter campaign is ongoing, so please donate and help us continue our quality programming you have come to depend on. Please support independent media. Just like every week, I've collected some interesting stories from the Russian newspapers for you. Let's begin, as we typically do, with the Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the Russian government-owned newspaper, the edition for November 16, 2016. In the upper left corner of the front page, we see the black and white photographs of the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the US President-elect Donald Trump holding the phone receivers. The title of the article is "And the other things will be talked about at the meeting," with the subtitle, "Putin and Trump had their first phone conversation." The article explains that on the night of November 14th, there was a phone conversation between Putin and Trump. Both Putin and Trump said that they were ready to work together actively, which was not something that Hillary Clinton could say to Putin had she gotten elected. Most significantly, Putin and Trump agreed that they would combine their efforts to fight against what they consider to be the common enemy, terrorism and extremism, and that therefore there is plenty of space for cooperation. The article states that Putin once again congratulated Trump on his victory and wished him success in fulfilling his electoral promises. Putin also said that he would be willing to engage in a strategic dialogue with the United States on the basis of the following principles: equality, mutual respect, and non-interference in internal domestic matters. The article reports that both Putin and Trump agreed that the current state of relations between Russia and the United States were unsatisfactory. They promised to work on their normalization and renew cooperation in many different fields. It is also significant that Putin and Trump talked about the economic ties between Russia and the United States and how to rebuild them. As is well known at this time, the US has very much cut these ties by imposing harsh economic sanctions on Russia. The research on the usefulness of economic sanctions shows, however, that the sanctions were successful in attaining their goal only in about 30% of the cases. In my opinion, the present US sanctions fall into those 70% which were failures. The article reminds its readers that next year will mark 210 years since the establishment of diplomatic relations between the US and Russia. It speculates that this anniversary may provide additional motivation for the return to the pragmatic, mutually beneficial relations between the two countries. In my opinion, this article in the government-owned newspaper shows that Russia expects from the new United States presidential administration a positive change in relations. The Russians are focusing on the areas of possible collaboration and are willing to extend their hand to Donald Trump. We have to see whether Trump will reciprocate. I'm sure that we won't have to wait for too long to find out. However, I can already say right now that Trump will face a tremendous opposition from the so-called foreign policy establishment in both Democrat and Republican political parties, and also from the members of the US Congress, where many anti-Russian lobbyists have operated for years. Of course, much will depend on the persons Trump chooses to head the key departments of the government. The Washington foreign policy establishment, including the think tanks such as the CFR and the Atlantic Council, will try to impose their favorite candidates on Trump. If Trump turns to them for staff and advice, not much will change, and many in the United States, Russia, Europe, and all over the world will be disappointed. The world might be back on the brink of a nuclear war. Now let's go to Izvestia, the moderate pro-government newspaper, the edition for November 16, 2016. The front page is dominated by the news of the arrest of the Russian economy minister, Alexei Ulyukayev. He was under surveillance by the Russian Domestic Intelligence Service, the FSB, for more than a year, and has now been arrested due to the suspicion that he demanded a significant bribe from the biggest Russian oil company, Rosneft. However, in my opinion, this arrest needs to be fitted into a larger framework of the internal political battles in the Kremlin and Putin's efforts to eliminate the so-called liberals from the government. This is precisely what I pointed out last week when I stated that the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, the President of Russia from 2008 to 2012, and the head of the liberal faction in the Russian government, was on his way out. I speculated, and I was the first among the English-speaking analysts to say that he was soon to be replaced by Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of the Russian National Security Council and the former chief of the FSB. Just a week went by and see what happened. The FSB in the forefront of the fight against the liberal faction, represented, among other people, also by the arrested minister Ulyukayev. It all makes sense if you know how to connect the dots. And that is precisely the sign of a quality analytics service that you are getting here at NewsBud. So please help our Kickstarter campaign. Well, let's leave the tearful Ulyukayev behind the bars of a Moscow jail and the fearful Medvedev shaking of panic in his prime minister's cabinet, worrying that he would be next on the FSB arrest list, and move to some important geopolitical issues covered in the same edition of the newspaper. On page 2, there is an article on the Russian involvement in Syria. The title is The Battle Baptism of Admiral Kuznetsov, the Russian aircraft carrier, the only one that the Russians have, which was recently sent to the Mediterranean. The subtitle explains that the President Putin received a report on the start of a massive military operation in Syria, and there is a photo of Putin smiling and shaking hands with the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu. The article reports that the Russian military has begun a massive operation against the terrorist formations in Syria. It states that this is the first time in the history of the Russian Navy that the operations are conducted with the participation of an aircraft carrier. The article quotes from the report Shoigu delivered to Putin. Shoigu stated that the Russian military has started a concerted attack on the militants of the Islamic State and the Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. In this operation, the Russian military planes Su-33 are taking off from the Admiral Kuznetsov. In addition, the guided rockets Kalibr are being fired from another ship, Admiral Grigorovich, and the rocket systems Bastion, which are already based in the coastal parts of Syria, have also been used. Shoigu stated that the targets of these attacks were the ammunition factories and arms warehouses of the militants. He also said that the Russian rockets hit and destroyed the facilities in which the Islamic State militants made chemical weapons, which they later used against the Syrian government forces. Responding to Putin's question about the overall security of the Russian forces in Syria, Shoigu pointed out that the Russian anti-aircraft rocket systems S-300 and S-400, as well as the Pantsir S-1 systems, are fully operational on the Syrian territory. He added that the Russians also repaired the S-200 systems, which belong to the Syrian army. During the meeting with Shoigu and other high-ranking officials of the Defense Department and the Russian military, Putin stated that though the Russian government budget had been negatively affected by the overall economic crisis, the money for the military would be forthcoming. He stressed that the resources must be used more effectively and a strict financial discipline must exist in all segments of the military. This would also be a good advice for the Pentagon. Putin pointed out the good news that by the end of the year, more than 50% of the Russian weapons will be based on the best technologies available. The Russian military will gain 60 new and 130 modernized aircraft, 60 rocket systems, a new type of submarine, and 310 new and 460 modernized tanks and armed carriers. In my opinion, the aim of this article is to display the present Russian military strength and its ability to conduct successful operations far away from the Russian mainland. It also informs the Russian audience and the world at large that the Russians assumed the full control over the Syrian skies. And so any attempt to establish a no-fly zone by the United States and NATO without the Russian and Syrian government permission is doomed to failure. In other words, Syria has been definitively lost by the West. A particularly heavy defeat has been suffered by the leadership of the Western intelligence agencies, which wanted to overthrow and replace the government of Bashar al-Assad, the foremost among them being the Saudi-connected CIA director John Brennan. Now, let's look at Nezavissimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, the edition for November 18, 2016. On the top of the front page, there is an article title that says, NATO raises its troop readiness, with the subtitle, The Alliance conducts the military exercise Iron Sword in Lithuania. The article continues on page 2. There is a color photograph of a soldier holding a NATO flag. The article explains that NATO member states continue permanent military exercises next to the Russian borders. As soon as NATO finishes a military exercise in the ex-Soviet Republic of Georgia on November 20th, on the very same day, it will begin this exercise in Lithuania. Under the name of Iron Sword, about 4,000 soldiers from 12 NATO countries will take part. The similar exercise also took place in Latvia, an ex-Soviet republic bordering Russia. Lithuania, on the other hand, borders the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, to which the Russians recently transferred rocket systems with nuclear weapons. The article quotes the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who stated that NATO plans to mobilize tens of thousands of soldiers and rotate them into the countries on the Russian borders, which, according to him, will protect these countries from the potential Russian aggression. Stoltenberg claimed that Russia has become much more assertive militarily in the last several years, and that NATO must work to contain the Russian power by significantly raising the readiness and number of its troops. According to one of the organizers of the exercise in Lithuania, the commander of the Lithuanian army, General Valdemaras Rupšys, the exercise will include not only the simulated conventional war games, but also the activities having to do with the so-called hybrid warfare, psychological operations, and propaganda. The article reports that Lithuania is one of the few NATO member states which have recently raised their military budgets to 2% of the GDP. According to the article, this will add significant new burdens on the Lithuanian government budget. While it is clear that the country is rapidly militarizing, it is not clear whether its budget can support additional expenses without further increasing the national debt. The article points out that Lithuania already has one of the highest ratios of the military to civilian population in Europe, 0.46%. For the sake of comparison, this percentage in Germany is 0.25%, and in France, 0.39%. The article comments that Stoltenberg likes to accuse Russia of dramatically raising its military expenditures, but he does not mention the fact that the military expenses of the NATO member states are several times bigger than the Russian expenses, and that Russia is far away from attaining parity. According to the article, if all NATO member states raised their military expenditures to the level of the 2% of the GDP, and there is a very strong push by the United States and NATO leadership for them to do so, then the total military expenditures in Europe next year will be $350 billion. On the other hand, the Russian expenditures next year will be around $45 billion. In other words, they are 7 times smaller. In addition to that, the number of NATO soldiers in East, Central Europe and Scandinavia is much bigger than the number of the soldiers in the North, West and South Russian military zones.
We're not preparing for war with Russia. NATO is a defensive alliance.
Well, in my opinion, this article puts things into perspective and demonstrates who really is a threat to whom. According to the article, militarization and endless warmongering in East Central Europe, as well as the resulting climate of instability and fear, is NATO's and not Russia's fault. Now we go to the newspaper Pravda, which is the newspaper of the biggest Russian opposition party, the Communist Party. Let's look at the edition for November 17, 2016. In the middle of the front page, we find an article with the title, "We are ready to build new relations," referring to the statements of the Russian Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov about the presidential elections in Moldova and Bulgaria, which both took place on Sunday, November 14. What is interesting in these two elections is that in both elections, the candidates described in the Western media as pro-Russian won. In Moldova, the president became Igor Dodon. According to the article, the communist leader Zyuganov already talked to Dodon and was encouraged by their conversation. it appears that Moldova, which is one of the former Soviet republics, will from now on build more positive political and economic ties with Russia than was the case in the recent past. The similar situation is also taking place in Bulgaria, which is a member of both the European Union and NATO. The person who became the new Bulgarian president, the former general Rumen Radev, called for the lifting of economic sanctions against Russia during the election campaign. He defeated a pro-NATO candidate, Tsetka Sacheva, and his victory can no doubt be seen as another defeat of the aggressive NATO policies in Eastern Europe. Radev's victory has already had severe political repercussions in Bulgaria because it led to the resignation of the current government of Boyko Borisov and new parliamentary elections in the coming months. It is important to note that it was precisely the Borisov government which, under the pressure from the United States and NATO, killed the prospects of the so-called South Stream, the pipeline project which was supposed to bring the Russian natural gas into East and Central Europe. Presumably, the new Bulgarian government will be more open to this idea, and this will cause a lot of panicky, sleepless nights in the NATO Brussels headquarters. All of this, of course, is well known to Zyuganov, and this is why this article in Pravda begins and ends on such a promising, positive note. The main gist of the article is that the political tide has turned in East Central Europe, and that it will only be a matter of time before we see much more popular resistance against the anti-Russian NATO expansion project. Unless, of course, there is, in addition to Ukraine, the breakout of another proxy war between Russia and NATO in 2017, which could be caused by a massive false flag event in Europe, which I must warn you remains a distinct possibility. And lastly, this week, we will also take a look at the Russian semi-tabloid press. Let's take a look at the front page of Argumenti I Fatti, which is the weekly newspaper with the largest circulation in Russia, and the edition for November 16, 2016. On the front page, there is a photo montage of a bear and an elephant with a Trump-like toupee, with the Russian and US flags in the background. The heading below the photo montage is the question, did we make up with America? The heading refers to page 2, where there is a reader's question, which I will translate for you in its entirety. Here it is. Having found out about the triumph of Donald Trump in the US presidential elections, somebody called it the morning of hope for Russia and the world, while the Russian parliamentary deputies applauded. Are we making a judgment that is too hasty? The question is answered by Fyodor Lukyanov, the main editor of the magazine called Russia in Global Politics. Lukyanov says that to hear the applause for Trump in the Russian parliament was a bit humiliating, because that is not the way that a great power should react to election results in some other country. He also sees no reason for the euphoria. According to him, the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia since the 1950s have followed a strictly predictable path. First tensions, then relaxation, or the period of escalation followed by the period of de-escalation, and so on. Lukyanov believes that Trump will focus more on domestic matters and have less time and resources to devote to the regime change in Russia. However, he states that this attitude toward Russia has already become evident even under Obama. According to Lukyanov, Trump never said that he liked Putin, but only that Putin is strong and that Obama is weak. Trump also said that Putin does not respect Obama, but will respect him. Lukyanov concludes that such comments are not enough to be able to tell whether Trump will in fact be a friend of Russia. In my opinion, it is interesting to see that there is a lot of skepticism in the Russian semi-tabloid press about Trump and the possible change of attitude toward Russia by the United States. This implies that the shapers of public opinion in Russia, who use the tabloid press as a way to influence the hearts and minds of the Russian people, have still not decided whether they truly want to support the lessening of political tensions between Russia and the United States. In other words, if your country has difficult internal problems to deal with, the easiest political thing to do is to distract people's attention by referring to the imagined or real enemies outside the country. The corrupt, warmongering US establishment fits the role of the real enemy perfectly. However, if you tell the people that now you have a friend in the White House, you lose the powerful political weapon of manipulation with fear and resentment. And in my opinion, neither the Russian nor the US political elites have made the decision to pursue the policy of détente. And this decision may not be made anytime soon. Dear friends, this is all for today. Thank you for watching. Please support our campaign on Kickstarter. And in the end, be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian Newspapers Monitor. Thank you.
Support independent media. Go to Kickstarter.com today.